Days of rain and cold weather, and then we have a sunny Saturday, and you choose to come to listen to Higgs bosons and quantum theory rather than be on your bike or go for a picnic. That's like, hey. We definitely have something in common, even though I love biking and picnicking too. Okay, so we were waiting for people to come in. It's Saturday, and I guess people are a little slow getting here. But we're going to start because I like to start on time, and we've got a lot to do. So welcome to our classroom. This is the MICH classroom. This is where we hold our classes. And actually, we use the whole floor, as you'll see what happens today. What we wanted to do was set up a typical day at MICH, so that you get a sense of, okay, how does the school operate when we come to our experiential weekends? What does that entail? So today is just a little taste of that, and we're going to do that. So you'll see that it's interspersed, although I'm doing a lot more lecturing today than I usually do because I have to introduce some topics, obviously, and make sure that we have some common vocabulary and that you understand what we're talking about and what MICH is. But other than that, most of our day is usually experiential, as you'll see. So up until I'm going to blab at you until break, and then blab a little bit more, and then you guys are going to do an exercise, and then come back, and then talk a little bit, and then we'll go for lunch. You're going to come back, I'm going to talk a little bit, and then you're going to do another exercise. So the day is usually interspersed that way between your participation and experience in the exercise and me introducing the topic. So I'm Judy Ann McNamara. Yeah. To make sure that my identity didn't change since this morning. You never know. But yeah, it says here I am, that I am. My background is physics, as you'll see, or sort of guess as the conference goes on. One of the projects that I worked on was the Tokamak Project. I was very excited. It was my first real job as a physicist. I don't know if anybody knows about the Tokamak. It was our Quebec's big investment, actually, Hydro-Québec and IREC, with the Institut de Recherche d'Énergie de Québec and the NIRS here in Quebec, invested a lot of money into the idea that maybe we can make fusion happen. And the idea of fusion, which would be non-polluting, non-dangerous, without any danger to the environment, and that we could produce all the electricity that we would want or hope for through nuclear fusion, was the dream that I was attached to at that time. And so worked there designing the electronics to count the very, very fast particles that were there. Then from then, that didn't work, by the way, just to let you know. We tried hard, but couldn't make it work for all sorts of reasons. But then I went on to more medical physics and some of the research there. Looked at everything from, with Tons University in Nova Scotia, looking at the space shuttle tiles to the AIDS virus, the crystalline structure of the AIDS virus. So did all sorts of stuff, and then saw an experiment that showed biophotons, and that sort of twisted my brain, and then I was never the same since then. And you'll see why. So we'll talk about all that. And that's what led me then to look at subtle energy fields, alternative medicine, and then finally homeopathy. Got sort of turned on to that in 1990, so it's been 25 years that I've been on the other side of physics. And our team is a very fascinating team. At the end of the day, I'm going to introduce you to everyone. We have people from all backgrounds. Okay, so just so that you know, it doesn't matter whether you're a lawyer, a doctor, an Indian chief. It's not about that. It's about what it is to be human. It's about consciousness. It's about life. And you can see from our team, we've got people from education backgrounds, medical backgrounds, business backgrounds, technological backgrounds, as well as complementary medicine and yoga and that kind of thing as well. So a nice eclectic mix. Okay, so we'll do the formal introductions later on. So just a little bit about MICH, because what is this container you're sitting in called MICH? And I guess our mission is maybe the important part to start with. So the Montreal Institute of Classical Homeopathy, at least that's what we say MICH stands for now. We might change it one day, you never know. But right now it's that, is dedicated to innovating and teaching therapeutic approaches to increase vitality and well-being. That's really what's most important, right? As human beings, we need to be vital and we need to feel good. We need to feel good about ourselves, about life. Otherwise, what are we going to get done anyway, right? Also to accommodate and facilitate evolution and to embrace the immaterial reality of life. Those are the 3 parts of our mission. And what's important to see about these 3 parts, vitality, well-being, evolution, and immaterial dimension, that those 3 parts are really the 3 central parts to life, as we're going to see today. What I'm going to show you today is how leading-edge research, and I'm talking about Princeton University, Harvard, I'm talking about the Ivy League schools and the well-established universities, okay? Looking at their accepted published research, and what is it telling us? And what it's telling us is exactly what the MICH mission is that our vitality and well-being is directly linked to evolution, our adapting to change, our adapting to life, and to the immaterial dimension that we're going to explore today. Now, I'm calling it the immaterial dimension because we live in a very materialistic paradigm. We've reduced ourselves to mechanical, chemical beings that just run on chemistry and that we can explain mechanically. And that materialistic paradigm has sort of infiltrated our consciousness and makes it difficult for us to be able to see ourselves a little differently than that. So we're going to look at the challenges, especially of accepting that immaterial dimension today. Now, obviously, I only have a couple hours to go through a whole lot of stuff with you guys. So just to let you know that there are other webinars that have been recorded. There's a whole lot of documentation, and there's always stuff that we are posting and putting more and more on our website. So at any time, you can go on there and watch a film or find out more or read an article. Okay. So I'm going to open today's talk with the leading edge research in biology and medicine right now, which has to do with these little organelles called mitochondria. Right now they're pretty popular. I don't know if you remember that from high school biology, but every cell has one. Okay. Actually, they have much more than one. They have a whole bunch of mitochondria. Mitochondria are to a living organism, to an animal like us, as chloroplasts are to plants. Okay? The chloroplasts in plants create all the food existing on the planet. Without chloroplasts, we would not be able to survive. Without mitochondria, we would not be able to survive, not even a moment. As a matter of fact, some scientists, you know how scientists like to do that, they took the mitochondria out of a cell to see how long it would last. It didn't. Okay. So we can't live without mitochondria. Mitochondria are tiny organelles that we've always called the powerhouses of our cells. Okay, that's where energy is created for everything you want to do. So there's nothing from breathing, from your heart beating, from a nerve end being triggered, anything. You can't do anything without mitochondria producing the energy for that. So every cell, okay, so when you eat your food, and actually when you breathe, okay, every piece of food that you eat at the very, 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 very end of that digestive process has to be brought to a cell, and in that cell, that food is then translated into energy that your body can use. And that process is carried out by mitochondria. Okay, so as a matter of fact, the only reason you breathe and what's causing you to breathe, you know, if you've ever tried to hold your breath and you can't, it's because all your mitochondria are screaming at you. Basically, we breathe for our mitochondria. It's that oxygen is carried directly to the mitochondria that use the oxygen. It's very necessary for them to use the oxygen in order to be able to release that energy. Do you remember what plants do when they create energy? What do they release into the air? Oxygen. So that oxygen they release in the air is the one that you have to breathe in again so that your mitochondria can reverse the process of having the energy stored to the energy released. Cool, eh? Okay? And then the carbon dioxide you breathe out is what the plants take in order to make that energy again. So that's the cycle of life. So mitochondria are right at that core of life. Huh? They're at the bottom of the Krebs cycle. They're at the bottom of all of what we can call vitality, health, and energy. So every organ, every muscle, every nerve. And I don't know if you guys have heard about the paleo diet. Anybody here heard about the paleo? No? Paleo diet, yeah? It's pretty popular. And high intensity interval training, HIIT. So all of those ideas have come from the research in mitochondria. Realizing how important the mitochondria are and how they work, and then we develop diets and exercise plans according to what's going to stimulate our mitochondria the most. So if you go on the internet, you'll see that there's reams and reams of information on the mitochondria. I also have on my blog, there's a couple of articles on quantum biology, the new frontier for mito, if you want to know some more of those basics as well, okay? All right. So just what the research has brought out very recently, and it's over the last 10 years, we always thought we could do nothing, eat a lot, work like maniacs, and then just take a drug when we don't feel well, and that it would all work together, right? Just take a vitamin pill or an antibiotic and you'll be fine. Well, as we found out now that we've done that for a few years, that doesn't work so well. That all of these things actually take a toll on our bodies, take a toll on our life force. And it took quite a lot of research to discover exactly how that happens. We knew it was happening, but what is the mechanism, you know? And you see all of this chemical soup in the body, and like, what, you know, I'm just saying it from a biologist's viewpoint, right? A biochemist's viewpoint. They're looking, look at this chemical soup, and yeah, and that's what ends up being a disease, and yeah. Well, guess what? It's the impact on the mitochondria. All of these things impact our mitochondria. And the development of chronic disease can only happen when the mitochondria say it will. So all the stuff that you hear about, oh, you have the DNA or you have the gene for breast cancer or for this or for that, okay? Yeah, there might be a predisposition, but that's not going to happen until your mitochondria turn that gene on. Okay, and if they can't turn that gene on, they'll turn another one on, if it comes to that. Okay, so what we've understood about the epigenetics and about our DNA is that actually mitochondria are behind all this. So you're going to see the plot thickens as we go through this. Mitochondria are really at the center of a lot of stuff. So there's a new term out there. Remember, we used to talk about homeostasis. You know, it was, and unfortunately, I'm going to say really unfortunately, all the blood tests that you get and the technology that your doctor uses when he or she analyzes your blood results are based on the theory of homeostasis. Homeostasis is as if there's this ideal balance point in every human being of exactly what balance there should be of all of the chemicals in your body. And if you're outside that balance point, we've got to give you a drug. Okay, so that's an old paradigm, that's the old idea of homeostasis, okay? It's evolved since then, because we realize it's a little bit more complex than that. And that we actually go out and in to balance all the time. So if someone near to you dies, your blood is going to be all over the place. And that's from the grief. And taking a lot of chemicals is not going to help the situation. Okay, and that's what we're discovering. It just puts even more load on your mitochondria, which even makes you more sick. So what would just be a period of adaptation, right? And yes, it is stressful. Any grief, any loss, any change, any move causes stress. But that stress is just a signal that we're adapting. And that adaptation is a necessary part of life. And through that adaptation, we lose our homeostasis. But the question isn't, how do I give myself drugs so I get back to homeostasis? It's, how do I adapt so that my body can go back to homeostasis, right? Okay. So this is now, as you know, science split up into really strict categories. When I was in university, they would not allow me to take biology and physics together, and I thought, what? You know, like, how can I, anyway, I had to leave university to be able to do that, you know. They didn't like my doctoral thesis because it brought in the effect of microwaves on living organisms, so they weren't too happy about that. So no, we keep, you know, look, you know, talk to the biologists about that and talk to physicists about that. It's as if those two worlds were different. And that's what we've done with science, right, is that we became really, really specialized. But what's been happening over the last 10 years is recognizing the limits of that, and it just doesn't work. Everything is connected. So where all of this new edge and leading edge research is coming from is in transdisciplinary work. So they have a bunch of scientists from all different disciplines that are working together in more and more of the laboratories and more of the research centers. And what they're discovering is, yeah, you know, here we thought, we always looked at stress. We had this psychological stress and we had physical stress. Physical stress is caused by taking medication, by pollution, by, you know, all that stuff. You know, by not, you know, overexerting ourselves. But there's psychological stress, and what's interesting is that the psychological stress, quote unquote, has even greater effect on the organism. And recent studies have shown that, yeah, psychological stress, even just set thought patterns, impact the mitochondria even more than the pollutants that you take in. These guys are getting weird, eh? And we've been able to map the whole territory of chronic disease, understanding that there's all of these. You've heard probably of cortisol, DHEA, inflammatory cytokines. These are all the bad guys, you know, that cause all this problem in our body, you know, our rheumatism and our aching joints and our things that lead to diabetes, to Alzheimer's, depression, cardiovascular dysfunction, and everything else. And that chemical soup is the body trying to adapt itself. So it's an adaptation process that the body is really, really working hard to do. And it's via, again, the mitochondria that it's trying to do that. Okay, so as I said before, the mitochondria cause epigenetic changes. In other words, they'll turn genes on and off, including our oncogenes, including cancer, and all of the genes associated with chronic disease. You cannot develop any chronic disease unless your mitochondria said, okay, we're going to send out these signals. And yeah, there's secondary effects to these signals. You're going to feel inflammatory processes. You're going to not feel well, you're not going to digest your food as well, but we've got to try to find a way to bring your body back into balance. So this is one of the papers written by Martin Picard, who is a PhD in mitochondrial, as a matter of fact, that's his phrase, mitochondrial allostatic load. He's the scientist who actually discovered that allostasis, okay, rather than homeostasis. Allostasis means not just one balance, but take a look at what's happening in the whole organism on all levels, mental, emotional, physical, okay? So don't talk about homeostasis just in your blood. Talk about allostasis, which involves, yeah, are you grieving? Did something happen? Did you get a divorce? You know? Look at all the psychological aspects and look at what's happening everywhere in the body, not just at one chemical. So from homeostasis we went to allostasis, and from allostasis to allodynamic. Okay, stasis meaning set, as if we're supposed to go through life one way, and dynamic saying no, that we have to look at everything that's happening, body, mind, soul, and look at it dynamically as how it's changing with life. So Martin published this in Nature. He's a young researcher that graduated from MICH, as it turns out. And so he's one of us. Okay. So one of the important and basic and fundamental understanding at MICH is that the chief component of chronic stress is perceived threat. Perceived threat. So it's interesting because when they measured what's called the allostatic load, when they measured the stress threshold of people before it becomes a disease, what they realized is that if you're crossing the street and a car is coming towards you and you run to get out of the way and your heart is pounding and everything else, that your stress level is very high in that moment. But the fact that you ran, you got out of breath, and you did something about it, and of course that you got out of the way, that's sort of an important factor, okay, that your body will go right back to normal after that, within seconds. But perceived threats, like, what does my boss think of me? And oh, I saw the way he looked at me, and maybe that means that he doesn't think I'm working hard enough. Or, my husband talked to me in that tone. Does that mean he doesn't really love me? Or my sister-in-law, or my mother, right? All of those perceived, the fear of judgment, the fear of not being good enough, the fear of not performing, all of those perceived threats are actually what we don't recuperate from. The fear of not having enough, the fear of not having enough money, it's these ideas in our head that are already projecting that we're, a bag lady or on the street or whatever, That's what causes us the chronic stress, and that's what leads to disease much faster than any other kind of stress. Okay, so the worst type of threat is what is perceived to be in threat as far as a self-image, beliefs, worldview, ideals, anything we identify with. And what keeps the stress high is the inability to adapt in a way that's going to, because what are you going to do with your ideas? If you're, I was thinking of a group of people, they were so afraid of Quebec separating that they would lose all their money, right? And so they lived in this chronic stress. Every time there's a referendum or the PQ comes to power, it's like, I'm going to lose all my... What do you do with an idea like that? It's not real, okay? It's an idea, it's a projection, it's a theory, but you're sending that fear, your body doesn't know what's going on. All it knows is that you are in a mental state of perceiving an immediate threat. And it's saying, well, we've got to do something. We've got to do something. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? How do we handle this? Huh? So that's what keeps stresses high. And adaptation, to the ever-changing circumstances of the world, because that's what life is called evolution. And so stress is an important part of evolution. That's why we have stress, is that so we can make those changes, we can adapt to what's happening, and adapt our lives to what's happening. So stress is the natural mechanism. Stress isn't a bad thing. Okay? It's good in short bouts of things that are real. Where stress is a bad thing is when it's about things that aren't real, aren't going to happening right now in this moment. Okay, so stress is that natural object. When it remains high, it's because we're not adapting. It's because we're staying in some kind of idea or fear that isn't really reflecting the here and now. Okay, so that's the basic philosophy of MICH as far as our vitality and well-being. It's very well grounded in current research. It's very understandable, and to be honest with you, it is addressing what is the major ill and the cause of chronic disease in our society. Because we really should not be having the chronic disease that we have in our society, should we? We eat well, we sleep well, we have warm clothes, we have a warm house. Why do we have so much chronic disease? And that's a question that we have to ask ourselves. Okay, the next part is evolution. And as we said, new adaptation, stress, evolution, and the mitochondria at the origin of complex life and evolution. The mitochondria are the key of evolution. These little guys, I'm telling you, they're very popular. We would not have life on the planet, life would have never evolved on the planet, had the first mitochondria not entered a bacteria cell. It's in the symbiotic relationship between the mitochondria and a bacteria cell that they formed a new cell that could then adapt and evolve. The bacteria that are out there have not evolved. They're just bacteria. But the bacteria that have the mitochondria in them have been able to evolve. So the mitochondrial DNA, because you have two DNA, you have your regular DNA, and that's the one we talk about all the time, that's in the nuclear cell. That is actually, we thought it was sort of the brain of the cell, and it's that controls everything in the cell. Well, it turns out it's not. It's actually the mitochondrial DNA. The mitochondrial DNA we inherit from our moms. We don't inherit from both parents, by the way. We just inherit from our moms. So that's why Doug Wallace, Dr. Doug Wallace, in the 1970s actually found the first Eve and published that in Scientific American. I don't know if you remember that, where we traced humanity back to the first female Homo sapien in Africa. And we were able to do that. He was able to do that by studying the mitochondrial DNA, okay, that had been from all over the world, and being able to map that and bring it down to the one Eve, if you like. So just for us to understand or know that our mitochondria, then their specific role is to help us evolve and adapt to whatever circumstances there are. Okay? So where that adaptation doesn't happen is when we misperceive and misinterpret our environment as being dangerous to us when it isn't. Then how do they adapt to something that's in our imagination? It's basically what our modern disease and ills are based on. So the role of mitochondria in evolution then, and the importance of evolution in well-being. We need to change, we need to adapt. That's what life is about. It's not steady state. So whenever we resist change and we resist changes in our lives, we're actually going against our mitochondria and creating unnecessary stress in our organism. Okay? So that's why it's really important to see. So when we sit with a patient, we have to establish their level of vitality, their level of well-being, what their perceived threats might be. We also have to understand, through their point of view, what is changing in their lives and what they might be having difficulty adapting to, because that's really central to understanding what's happening in the organism. And then finally, the immaterial dimension. So this dimension, and these are pictures of mitochondria that Martin took. And Martin was the first person on the planet, as a scientist, to, actually he and I did it together, it was sort of cool. He was showing these pictures. I said, Martin, it's a field. Oh, he said, really? And I said, yes, look. These pictures of the mitochondria show there's what's called cristae in the mitochondria. These are little channels in the mitochondria. And these cristae, we always thought that mitochondria were little beans, sitting in the middle of the cell. Turns out they're not little beans sitting in a little cell. They're actually very dynamic. They're fusioning and fissioning and doing all sorts of a dance together. And part of this dance is the presence of an electromagnetic field, the presence of their response to something that we know is the signature of a magnetic field. And here's a picture of what they actually look like. So right in the center there is the nucleus of a cell. Okay, and in that nucleus is what is your inherited DNA from both parents, and what we make the big deal about whether or not you have a predisposition for this kind of cancer, that kind of whatever, right? That's where that is. But around that nucleus is the mitochondria, and notice how dynamic they are. And we don't see all of it here, but basically what they're doing is they're connecting and making synapses with each other, okay, in a constant dynamic motion. They are talking to each other. And just as the neurons in your brain are making synapses every moment of your day, so are these guys. Except when we're not well. When we're not well, I don't know if you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, you have the mitochondria that look like little beans. In other words, instead of being out and talking to each other and making all sorts of connections, they've actually closed in on themselves, and they look like little donuts. And we find that donut-shaped mitochondria in neurons with people with Alzheimer's, in the cells of the pancreas of people with diabetes. It's that turning into the self. It's almost like a defense mechanism, isn't it? You know, it's like that's happened. Okay, so that's what we see in the mitochondria of people with chronic disease. Whereas when we do, before or when we do not have chronic disease, we have these little guys talking to each other. So what we are beginning to understand and know, and what's beginning to be published in reviews such as, and medical, very well-established journals such as Nature Communications, etc. There's Martin just published another one in Nature Communications, discussing how mitochondria really form an interconnecting and intercommunicating intelligent network. Okay, so these little powerhouses that turn on and off genes, that determine how you're doing, and that are basically in control of all of the expression of disease or health in your body, are intelligent. They can process data, they can analyze, and they make decisions. One of the important decisions they make is when your cells will die. So death happens when the mitochondria select apoptosis, as it's called, and gets you pop off. You know, that's the cell death, right? This apoptosis and cell death. Now, what's interesting is that all of the mechanisms now involved in all of this data processing, intercommunication, and everything else are field effects. They're quantum effects. They are not chemicals. So right now, all of the research that's going on, all of the traditional research into cancer and all of the chronic diseases are driven by pharma, and pharma wants to find the protein that's going to cure the disease. It's what is the drug or the protein. They're looking for the chemical. And at the same time, we're discovering that it's not about chemicals at all. The chemicals are byproducts of what's really happening on a much deeper level, on that quantum level. Happening in the field, in the energy field of the mitochondria and the small organelles that are in our cells. Okay? So this quantum dimension, a lot of biologists don't like it because it's spooky. It's a dimension beyond 3D space-time. You just have to say that, right? all right. No, don't go there. A dimension intricately linked to consciousness, and that's what we're going to look at today, is how our cells, each one of our cells, is directly linked to universal consciousness, to the consciousness of which life is made of. And we're going to do exercises this afternoon to actually tap into that ourselves. Isn't that cool? Okay. Okay, so the mitochondria, which are found extensively in the nervous tissue, every single cell of your body, are showing us and helping us be really grounded in body-mind science and body-mind mechanisms. What really is the body-mind mechanism? And that's through, or a lot of the research anyway, has gotten into that field through the study of biophotons. So, and biophotons are now understood to be a communication of information, and really at the interplay of the material and immaterial dimensions. Dr. Doug Wallace, who I just talked to you about before, you know, the Eve who found the Eve, who studied all the DNA, calls the mitochondrial DNA the portals of chi. I'm telling you, even the biologists are getting weird. Okay, and that's what really our topic is today, is where mystery meets matter. Okay. And like I say, there's a lot of resources. If you look in the resources section of our website, there's all sorts of articles and films there. But I'm going to try as best as I can to synthesize this in a half hour. Okay, so the next step in human evolution is the recognition of the human organism as one whole, and the functioning of each human being as a cell within that whole. That's really what this research is coming to the conclusion of, is that there is a human organism called humanity, and that each of us are cells within that human organism. And that's what we're going to show how the research has brought that to our scientific reality, if you like. But we seem to have a little resistance. And also how vitality and well-being are directly related to meaningfulness. Okay, things have to be meaningful to the human being, both individually and collectively. Okay. And that's that immaterial dimension that we're going to talk about. So that's our mission. That's what we're about. So when you come to MICH, you're going to hear all about this kind of stuff, because that's what we do. But you can see that it's well-grounded. We've got one foot in science, and we're always at the leading edge of science, and even some of our graduates are involved in some of the leading edge research, and we're in direct contact with them. But we also have on the other side, a foot in that ultimate, bigger reality, which involves a paradigm shift. And so MICH is a lot about facilitating that paradigm shift in everybody who comes through our doors. And that's what's most important for us. Yes, we're a school of homeopathy, but homeopathy is our tool. Our mission is to bring the immaterial paradigm to awareness and to consciousness to humanity, so that we can become one whole in a very healthy way. Okay. So the way we set up our teaching, thanks to Melissa Dare, who brings us always the leading edge and most leading edge methods of education, is every class we look at in 3 parts. What do we want to understand? And that's a big U, understand. Because if you read any textbook that you had in high school or in college or even in university, you will not understand anything. There is nothing in any of those textbooks that brings understanding. I'm talking about especially if you're in the sciences. What we have in those textbooks are descriptions. Even take a textbook in psychology. I dare you to go to one of the CJEPs and to take one of their psychology textbooks and see if there's anything that helps you understand about life or about humanity, or if it's instead just a lot of knowledge, words, and information. And so we've confused understanding and knowledge, and actually that's a big part of why we get ourselves into trouble, is that we think that facts are understanding. Facts are information. Understanding happens on a different level. So what we want to understand today is that the current evolutionary challenge to humanity is to evolve from a materialistic worldview to a deeper immaterial reality. We have to get over our thing that drugs and chemicals are going to fix it all. And the implications of quantum biology with respect to the immaterial dimension. Okay, so that's what we want to understand today. What you're going to know about is you're going to know about the mitochondrial DNA, you're going to know a little bit about quantum processes. As you already know now that it's the mitochondrial DNA through quantum processes and not the nuclear DNA and chemical processes that determine health and disease. Okay, so it's not that a pharmaceutical drug doesn't have a place. It's not that it doesn't do anything. Of course it does. And there are times when it's absolutely needed because you're in a chemical crisis. But to think that that's going to cure you is a different story. So if you start taking Synthroid, is that going to cure your thyroid? Or are you on it for the rest of your life? If you start taking Synthroid for your thyroid, you're on for the rest of your life. That's not a cure. Taking a pill every day doesn't mean you're cured. It means that you're taking chemicals to try to get that balance. Now that sometimes you have to do that. We're not saying that, I don't want this polarity to happen here. We embrace allopathy and we embrace all of the technological advances that they do. They are life-saving. But when we don't understand that what we're taking isn't curing us, then we're confused. Okay? And so we have to understand what the real cause of disease is. And at some point, we have to address that cause, because otherwise you're going to take one drug, and then you're going to take another one, and then you're going to take another one, then you're going to take, because you have side effects from the first one that then can't be. The disease hasn't been addressed. Okay, and that's what we see. That's why we see people, and they say, well, we're living longer. Well, first of all, I would contest that, because all of the guys that I read about way back in the 1700s lived until their 90s. So I don't know, So of course, anyway, we can go into all the statistics about that, but that's another story. But we're seeing the people as they age and how much medication they're on. I don't even know how they can digest 50 pills a day, right? So we have to question ourselves. We've reached the upper limit as far as what technology can fix in our body, and we have to look at the real cause. And that's where homeopathy, and that's why homeopathy is our tool at MICH, is because it helps us with that cause. Okay. We also talked about the mitochondria as portals of chi, and we're going to go into now what that means. And that's going to bring us into realms of consciousness and the zero-point field and Higgs field and the Higgs boson. Isn't that fun? Okay. So you'll find out all about those guys too. And then what you're going to learn to do, because that's what every class has to have that. What do we want to understand? What do we want to know? And what do we want to be able to do? Because all of this knowledge and understanding is great, but if you can't do anything with it, right? So every class has something to do now. Usually the do is something to do with homeopathy when we're here, or something to do with the therapeutic process, or something that we can do with our lives. Some way of either contemplating our lives or using ourselves in a new way that brings us into this new paradigm. So what we're going to do today is we're going to distinguish between the realms of consciousness, and we're going to learn, at least take first steps, to how to engage those different realms. Okay, so I don't know if you know what you're coming for, but it's always a surprise sometimes when you come to MICH. Okay, so our essential question, Melissa also taught me this, our essential question for today is, why is it so difficult for us to change from a materialistic view to an immaterialistic one? I think this is an essential question that we have to ask. We're all stuck in this material paradigm. How do we get out of it, especially when it serves the purpose of lots of industries, for us to feel that we're stuff, that we have to look good, and it's all about what we own and what we have and what we, right? And what we take and what we can afford, rather than the immaterial part of us and who we really are. So it's trying to get out of that paradigm. But this question is becoming more and more fundamental to our well-being and our evolution. Living in a material paradigm is causing us a lot of unnecessary stress. And the question is also very fundamental to homeopathy, because homeopathy is an immaterial medicine. That's what gives us all the bad press. But there's nothing in it. There's no chemical. We go, yeah, we know. Well, then it's not going to do anything. And we go, no, it does. And we have 250 years of proof that it does. But it can't. There's nothing in it. Okay, so this is a kind of dialect that goes on. And the difficulty with, when we're coming from that materialistic paradigm and seeing ourselves as only chemicals, of course, and something that's not chemical, what's it going to do for me? Okay. So homeopathy is the medicine of the new millennia. It is the medicine of this new revolution in our understanding of the universe. And it's the medicine of the future. But it's a very, very tricky medicine to operate, because we can't use, and I don't know if anybody's here, but we have quite a few medical doctors come to our school to train as homeopaths. And they wow, I really have to admire them, because they've got to get out of a whole lifetime of being trained that we are a chemical vat. Okay, vat of chemicals that works mechanically. They've got to get out of that paradigm into one that embraces an immaterial level, and that sees us as totally different. That's challenging, so I really admire them. Sometimes it takes 3 years, but they get there, and then the light goes on, and then it's like, whoa. But anyway, but it is hard. It's hard when the more academics we've done, the more science we've done, the more information we have around this material idea, then the more difficult it is for us to embrace something that isn't that. Just normal and natural. Okay? But it's because it's the immaterial nature, it's a signaling quality that challenges our material paradigm. Okay. So what I want to show you today is some of the research that, the staggering evidence that homeopathy is effective, real, and powerful. And yet, in Quebec, and even in Canada, I was really disappointed with CBC and Marketplace and stuff like that. The resistance to accepting the research, the proof. you know? And the experience of millions of people, it's like, oh, we're just going to discredit that because we want to believe what we want to believe. Right? So whenever that kind of thing happens, when there's that kind of duality, that's when we have to tap into higher levels of consciousness to understand what do we have to understand in order for those two opposing views to make sense? Well, for those two opposing views to come together. Now, a curious phenomenon in humans is our denial of evidence. No? Never mind the facts, I'm going to believe what I want to believe. Don't confuse me with facts. Okay, so we have to look at that part of human nature today a little bit. Okay, and in order to do so, I thought maybe it's easier for us to look at the last paradigm shift. Because you know, when you look at what happened in the past, and you have some objectivity about it, you can see maybe you're a little less charged and dualistic about it yourself. You know, right now if we start talking about material versus immaterial, we can all get charged up about it. But let's look at the last time we went through this exercise. Remember this? That was when the Earth was in the center of the universe. Okay, so before Copernicus, this is what we believed. And this is what we felt was really true. And we really loved this because isn't it pretty? I mean, don't you want to live in that universe? Here we are at the very center. We are the apple of God's eye. At the very center of the universe, we just lie there on our bed called Earth, and the stars and the sun all move around us. The sun rises and it sets on us, and the stars rise and they set on us, and all of the planets and everything revolves around us. Yeah, that's pretty cool, right? And it's not only that, but they all are in perfect circles and in perfect harmony, and they even make music called the music of the spheres, which is true, by the way. But, right, this was our world view. Our view of the world. When I say that, I mean of the universe, of everything, of life. This is how things were for us. And it was lovely, and we had an important place for that. Because being that apple of God's eye, being right there at the center, and everything being for us, that meant that we mattered, that we counted. And not only that, but there was a direct relationship between the universe and us. And it also embodied harmony, beauty, power, all of those absolutes that Plato had talked about, in the form. So when Copernicus came along and said, no, the Earth is just another planet like the others, and it goes around the sun. You can imagine. Now, what was interesting is, even though we held this worldview as the truth and as the way things were, anybody who looked up at the sky at night would see that there was something wrong in the program. And there's what's called retrograde action of planets. In other words, planets move forward for a while, and then they move backward for a while, and then they move forward again. And they do that all the time. Well, if they're going around in perfect circles, why are they doing that? Like, you know, between you and me, it looks like God's screwing up. You know, like, how come it's not perfect? Anything God does should be perfect, and it should be in a perfect circle. So there's something very ungodly about this idea that there is this imperfection. So the mathematicians went to work, and the astronomers went to work, and they said, okay. This retrograde motion, by the way, if you don't know astronomy, then because of, you see the Earth going around the sun there, right? If we're looking at Venus or Mars, from the point of view of the Earth, you see from each point of view, if you mapped that on the sky, okay, it would appear that Venus is going forward and then backward, just because of where we are in our point of view. Do you see that? So when the Earth is here, Venus looks like it's there, right? When the Earth is here, it looks like it's there. So far so good. But when the Earth gets here, Venus is starting to be behind us. And so it looks like it's behind us. And then here it's even further behind us, you see? So from our point of view, then it's going forward and then it's coming backward. And that's just because it's in an orbit that's outside of ours. So, it made perfect sense, but that's what Copernicus said, but we didn't like that idea. We wanted to keep the harmony of spheres. So what we said is, okay, God isn't screwing up. He's just making circles within circles. See? So the Earth is still at the center, but the other planets are going around like this. And that's why they look like they're going backwards, but no, they're just doing little circles. That's all. So it worked for one planet. But then the more we looked at the sky, and then we started getting telescopes and then even seeing things even more, it got a little bit more complicated. Yeah, you remember the spirogyra thing, whatever they were? Yes, yeah. Okay, so yeah, it got really, really complicated, and to the point where there were so many footnotes. There were more footnotes than the explanation. So it was sort of falling apart. This is where our worldview started falling apart. Now, what's interesting about Copernicus is, he figured it out like really young in his career, but he never told anybody because he knew the church was going to get him. So he waited until his deathbed, and it was when he was sure he was going to die, he said, okay, you can publish it now. And it was published, and he died, and it was great. So they didn't get him. Now, in publishing it, of course, everybody said, this is stupid. I mean, come on, this doesn't make sense. If we're on a planet, you're telling us that we're on a planet going at tens of thousands of miles per hour, and don't forget that time, the fastest we went was running, or on a horse, right? We're going at tens of thousands of miles an hour, spinning through space, and we're not falling off? Mountains aren't collapsing? Like, it doesn't make sense. And you can see, for the person at that time, it wouldn't make sense, and people in China, why aren't they falling off too? I've asked myself. But the idea of spinning through space in this way and that way, I mean, come on, at that speed, our hair would be like this, Like, what's going on? Okay, so it took, even though it was published, it took another 100 years for Galileo to have the guts to actually talk about it. And he was arrested for believing in it. And he must have had some influence because they didn't burn him at the stake. They just put him under house arrest for the rest of his life. For the rest of his life, actually. He never, and he was convicted of heresy. So he spent the rest of his life in house arrest, and it took more than 300 years for the church to clear his name of heresy. So he made a big boo-boo. And in some ways, as we're going to see today, it wasn't without reason that there was so much resistance to this new Newtonian view. Because it wasn't only that the Earth wasn't the center of the universe, and that just a planet among planets, and that we were relegated almost to a backseat position. And the more we found out about the universe, the more backseat we found we were. Like, we're on this tiny little planet in the middle of nowhere, and we're not even close to the center of the universe. Like, we're zillions of miles away from the center of the universe. That was bad news. And the effect of that over time is part of the separation and the separateness that we feel today. As if the universe is something like way out there that we have really no connection to. And what does it mean? And the mechanics that went into developing that, called Newtonian Mechanics in the 1700s. So actually, Copernicus's theories weren't proved because Copernicus didn't have the physics. He could show it mathematically, but he couldn't prove that that's what was really happening until Newton came around. And then Newton with his law of gravity, and then the gravitational pull, and that's why everything worked the way it was. Then everything made sense. But until then, no. But with Newton, too, came this whole mechanical view, which of course is why we have all our technology today. I'm going to say our mechanical technology today, not our electronic technology. That's another era. But our mechanical technology, so we were able to make, trains and cars and all those great things that we love. And all those toys and mechanical and the Industrial Revolution came from Newton. So That was that revolution, if you like. But what that caused us was to lose a sense of the beauty, harmony, and perfection, and some of those ideals and archetypal values that other worldview had. And what's beautiful about this revolution is that it brings those back. Where we actually see our place in the universe, where things do have meaning, and where everything is related. So this quantum paradigm, this immaterial quantum paradigm, is really what's taking us home as human beings, after quite a long period of feeling like orphans. Okay, so over those years, it brought us to some real false tenets, that a lot of scientists hold as absolute truth, even though they've been disproven, as I'll show you. That matter or chemistry is the basis of life, that chemistry and our brain are the basis of consciousness. I went to there was this conference in Colorado, the emergence of consciousness. You go, wow, the emergence of consciousness. What they were trying to prove is that consciousness comes from our brains. What? Anyway. Okay. Yeah, right. That there was no consciousness until we came along and thought. And I said, well, this is really a displaced center of meaning, isn't it? But anyway, we'll take a look at that. Matter is the fundamental reality, and the human being is a survival machine. Yeah, right. It's eat or be eaten. Dog eat dog. And we're largely powered by chemical and genetic coding. Well, that does a lot to feed pharma and to feed a lot of drugs, but it's not true. And the communication of cells and the coding of DNA is chemical. We also still trying to prove that. And that the DNA is hardwired. This idea that your DNA, you're born with this DNA. The McClintock was a female researcher in the early 1950s, who proved that our nuclear DNA now, the actual DNA that, is always dancing and moving, and that there's even gene transposition, which was really weird. In other words, a gene that's over on this chromosome suddenly lands on this one, where it shouldn't be. Now, if your genes are carved in stone and this is it, then that shouldn't happen. So McClintock actually proved that it didn't. It took her 45 years to get the Nobel Prize for that. We did not want to believe. We wanted to believe that our DNA is etched in stone. And what you get is that's it. You inherited these genes from your parents. That's it for the rest of your life. And it determines you. We were so bought into that deterministic. And you listen to some of the stuff out there and you'd think that it's still true. Right? I mean, don't believe everything you hear in the news. Okay. So, and as if the DNA, as if those little that stuff set in stone as well, okay, just automatically goes through stuff like a machine, and that each one is independent. Right? Like every cell is if it's its own little universe, right, with its little brain called a nucleus, and it does what it does, and that was, determined when you were born, and that's it for the rest of your life, right? Well, that's impossible. We just have to, I'm just going to show you a film. Okay, this is a real film of real cells and what they do every day. This is happening right now in your body as you're sitting right here. Okay, all of your cells are multiplying. Your muscle tissue is repairing itself. Your stomach lining is recreating itself. You get a new stomach lining every 5 days. You get all of these things are happening in every moment of your life. So your cells are dividing and reproducing every moment. What does that look like? It looks like this. So if you took tissue, any tissue, and you just watch the tissue over a period of time, look at all the cells. Do you notice something? Do you notice the perfection with which they're dividing? Do you notice the synchronicity and how perfectly timed? I don't think there's any ballet that could be more perfectly timed and choreographed than that. Right? Now, are they sending proteins to each other to say, okay, it's time to divide? I'm halfway through, how about you? But no, that's the paradigm that we're living in. It's what's called protein communication. Well, you see, the people who call you for research grants, okay? All of that money, that's what it's going into. Well, we want to show which protein is causing this communication. It's impossible through chemistry. we've been talking about biophotons since the 1930s. The Russians, there's a whole bunch of people that talk about that, so I'll talk a little bit more about that. So I'm going to show you a film. This is a film from Tufts University. They're trying to promote some of their work they're doing to get funding, okay? And they have to gently break it to the world that it's not about chemicals. Okay, so what they've done is they're trying to show the world, because they want to get funding for what they're doing, which is looking at electromagnetic fields, is looking at field effects in living beings, and the reality that when those cells divide, it's because there's a field effect happening. It's not a chemical thing, it's not a protein, it's really a field effect. It's an immaterial phenomenon, a quantum.
Was that those negative charges overlap in areas where those cells are going to become part...
Whoops, sorry. So what she's going to tell, I forgot to tell you exactly what she's going to say, because I sort of, what she's going to talk about is, they look at these embryos, okay, it's tadpoles actually, and they're watching how tadpoles develop from a single cell into a whole tadpole. Now, if you really just contemplate that for a second, you have one single cell that somehow is going to divide in ways that it loses its sort of generic, everyday kind of single cell and becomes either an eye or a tail or a muscle or a nerve or a, right? Like, it has to specify, it has to become a different kind of cell than it is as an embryo. Okay? As an embryonic cell, it has to become a totally different kind of cell with a very specific function. It has to transform into that. To this day, there is no biology book in any school that is going to tell you how that happens. It just says, and the cells divide, and then they become specified, and it describes it. And if you read it without thinking, you think you know what's happening, but all you're being told is what's happening, not how it's happening. So the mechanism by which cells divide that you just saw, and the mechanism by which cells become specific in their function cannot be explained through the biology and the biochemistry that you learned in high school, or that they're even learning in high school today. Okay, it cannot be explained. There's no understanding that comes from that. We have to go to the immaterial dimension to understand that. And what shows the immaterial dimension, how you know the immaterial dimensions is around, is because there's either light or fields. Okay? Light is not matter. It sits on the border between matter and non-matter, and so do fields. Okay? So anytime I use light or fields, you know that I'm leaving the material 3D world and actually talking about another dimension. So when we see that kind of thing happening, we know that that dimension is involved. And this is what these ladies are trying to delicately tell the world, and still not lose their funding, all right, and actually gain some. It's very tricky. It's very tricky.
Part was that those negative charges overlap in areas where those cells are going to become parts of the face.
So just cell divisions, lots of activity, front end of the spinal cord.
Flash. Look, watch. See the flash of light?
There's the brain, mouth, pharyngeal arches.
See the flash of light?
Eye, nose, ear.
Flash.
All of these things are in some way being regulated by a single type of signal.
She tried to pass that one by. A single type of signal. Okay. This guy, isn't he handsome, eh? 1938, Fritz Albert Popp. This is how I went from classical physics, well, not really, but what really turned me on to subtle energy fields was linked with his work, was his looks. Yeah. Well, 1938, by the time, you know, could have been, though. Could have been. But anyway, experimental. So this guy has a background in experimental physics, theoretical physics, biophysics, and medicine. He's got like PhDs up the yin-yang. He won the Retrograde Prize in University of Mainz when he was very young. And part of the New York Academy of Sciences, the Russian Academy of Natural Sciences. In other words, super brain. Okay? Super brain. Okay. And he was considered of Nobel Prize stature. He discovered and made the first extensive physical analysis of biophotons. Right? 1950s and 60s. And subsequently lost his professorship position, his funding, and his reputation, and his laboratory. Like that. You want to know how you'd lose all your money? Just talk about biophotons. So we no longer burn people at the stake, but we do the modern version. We destroy their reputation, refuse to publish their results, and take away their funding. And that's because our world is associated with our ideals. Huh? We have ideals now that are based on a materialistic paradigm, and we're very attached to them. And they're the basis of the structure of our society and how we interface with each other, the structure of our medical system, and everything else. So it's really woven in. But anyway, but like I say, but luckily, courageously, many scientists persist. Okay, so, and he was one of them. He's still working to this day. He's still operating the laboratory. He's quite incredible. One of the experiments he did, he destroyed 99% of a cell with UV light and then entirely repaired the damage in a single day with the same wavelength of the same frequency of that light. Isn't that amazing? And that's actually what he demonstrated was the ancient law of similars. And that's what homeopathy is that we take the signal, like that's the principle of homeopathy, is that you actually take the signal that's causing the harm and you find something similar to it, but of a much, 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 much lower intensity. And that signal brings the cell back to life. Okay, so he was already getting in trouble. Doctor, it says doctor of homeopathy, eh? And you think that's going to save you. Okay, back to here. One of the work that he's still doing and did for many, many years is show how carcinogens and a lot of the bad stuff in our food and everything else, why or how they actually cause cancer. Okay? So we have statistics about how things, saying, if you take too much of this, it's going to cause cancer. As if we know what we're talking about. We have no idea, though, how it does that. We just know that the statistics seem to tell us that. Very big difference. Again, knowledge, but not understanding. Okay. What he understood is that these carcinogens scramble light frequencies. So the difference between something that helps you and something that doesn't is the something that helps you, and this is what he found like really wild, is whatever good food there is, okay, the light goes through it and stays what we say coherent, okay, it stays in a coherent movement. But when we put the same light through something that is going to actually hurt you or harm you, the light signal gets scrambled, the biophotons get scrambled, and it's incoherent light, which means that instead of carrying one signal, it's like all over the place and incoherent. In other words, it can't be decoded. So your body, when it's getting your food and goes all the way down to the mitochondria, it's not looking for stuff. It's looking for a code. That code comes through that light. So the food you eat is encoded. Now his findings were dismissed because he couldn't identify the source of the biophoton emission in the cells. He measured biophoton emission in living beings. So not only did he do these light experiments, but he also, measured, okay, here's a cell, how much biophotons come off of it, and all that kind of stuff. And the rest of the science said, what do you mean cells send light? That doesn't make sense. Like, any light signal, light doesn't go more than a couple of microns into your skin, and then it gets absorbed. So why would a cell send out a signal with light when it's going to get absorbed by its neighbor? Couldn't it just sort of send over a protein? Makes more sense to me. So that he couldn't explain why, and that he couldn't explain where it was coming from, but here he had thousands and thousands of experiments and experimental proof that it was true. And anybody who tried to redo his experiments could also prove it was true. But we couldn't explain it. So if these biophotons represent signaling, what and to whom are they signaling? Now, instead of being curious about that, like that's what I would have done, right? Say, wow, that's actually what I did. It's like, okay, I want to know that, right? We said, no, it doesn't make sense to me, don't want to see it. Okay. So what we know today is that the emission of biophotons actually happens from the mitochondria. Those guys again. Okay, the mitochondria send out biophotons when they no longer know how to cope with the stress that's happening in the individual. So biophoton emission comes from cells when, as a stress response, as a, help. Okay, little cry for help. So, who are they crying for help to? And that's what we want to talk about. This immaterial dimension is what we call the quantum dimension of all possibilities, all possible outcomes, all imagined and unimagined ways of living, okay, of adapting and evolving. That realm of quantum possibilities, you can call consciousness if you want, because it really is intelligent. It's the sea in which we live. And there's a lot of questioning about that. Well, really? I go, yeah. As a matter of fact, last year at CERN's Hadron Collider, they proved the existence of what's called the Higgs boson, or Higgs particle. And that allowed scientists to explore the Higgs field. So Higgs was another weirdo physicist, who said, guys, there's a field out there. But unlike other known fields, because we talk about electromagnetic fields, and I showed you the magnetic field and how the mitochondria seem to be lining up to an electromagnetic field and respond to electromagnetic fields as well. Yes, there's electromagnetic fields, but electromagnetic fields and light are a, if you like, byproduct of that deeper underlying field. They're not it itself. Okay, so the field that we're talking about is deeper than either the electromagnetic field or light. Okay. This field has a non-zero constant value almost everywhere. Well, what does that mean? Let me just tell you. In other words, at 0 degrees Kelvin, okay, so there's this temperature that we call 0 degrees Kelvin in physics, which is the coldest of cold. It's even colder than a Montreal winter. Even this winter in Montreal, we never got close to 0 degrees Kelvin. Because at 0 degrees Kelvin, there is no energy at all, at least in what we can consider to be energy as it exists for us. Okay, there's no thermal action, which means that there should be no movement, which means that the particles should be completely frozen, like the way you are at the bus stop. Right? Like all of the particles at this temperature should not be able to move. But guess what? Even at 0 degrees Kelvin, these particles are vibrating and bouncing around, which means that they have some kind of energy. But it's no kind of energy that we know of. So this 0 point, I love the way we say things, the 0 point energy field. So the 0 point, at the 0 point, or absolute zero, because there's still vibration and movement happening, okay, it's always like a background noise in any other experiment you're going to do, right? Because it's like energy that isn't part of your experiment or one that you can explain, but there's always this little bit that's there in the background even when you go down to zero. So what did we do with that for over 50 years? Guess. Yeah, we just subtracted out of our equations. Easy. You can't explain something, you just take it out. Right? That's what we did with organs for the longest time, right? I didn't know, what are those tonsils for anyway? I rip them out. There's that noise, I rip them out. You don't need those. They would do a 3-for-1 special, Okay, so that's what we do with things, but not necessarily the right thing to do. Okay. So, what are the mitochondria saying, and who are they saying it to? When the mitochondria get to the place where they go, geez, I have just used up all my possibilities. They're thinking and connecting and saying, what do we do, what do we do, what do we do, what do we do? Can't figure it out. Help, help. In other words, they start connecting, sending this information out to the 0 point field of consciousness, where all of the possibilities are, And the 0 point field starts giving them other possibilities. They're praying, you know? Okay. So we now know that light emission is a bioquantum process and not related to chemical processes. It would have been nice for us to recognize that before we took all of his money away. But anyway, he survived. More importantly, there are signals to the 0 point field of all quantum possibilities for new possibilities to keep the organism alive. Okay, so all through this lecture, just remember that light is on the frontier. It's the boundary between the material and the immaterial realms. Okay, whenever we see light coming from an organism, it's because it's right on that frontier. The emission indicates the call to action of the immaterial dimension. Right? So your little mitochondria are asking for help all the time. So we know from Einstein's theory of relativity, nothing can go faster than the speed of light. Everybody heard of that? Right? Nothing goes faster than the speed of light. That is true in the three-dimensional world that we live in. And it's true for the three-dimensional world that we live in because everything in the three-dimensional world that we live in is made of light. You can't go faster than yourself. Have you ever tried that? I'm going as fast as I can, but maybe I can go a little bit faster. It doesn't work. Well, that's why nothing can go faster than light, because we're made of light. Make sense? See, it all makes sense once we start understanding it, right? And I'm not going to talk about homeopathy a lot today, but just to, contextualize it, when we talked about all those stress mechanisms and affecting the mitochondria, and then the mitochondria is sending out a signal, right? Help, help, help. Well, guess what we do as homeopaths? Is that we sit with that patient, and through a different dimension of consciousness, we act as the bridge between the mitochondria and the 0 point field, to find a homeopathic remedy that is going to produce a signal. Remember she said one signal? Okay, a signal that's going to help that mitochondria find a new way of adapting. So much fun. I can't tell you. We have a ball. Okay, and when you see it work, like, it sounds really weird, right? But when you see it work, when you've sat for an hour and a half with the patient and you've used our method to come to exactly what's happening in their world, and of course we're not talking about, we're talking about, like, what happened in your life and how did you feel and all of the mental, emotional, and ideals and the whole person. You're really looking at the whole person. Not just their symptoms, but their whole being. And from that conversation that we have with them, we go and we find out of the 5,000 remedies that we have, the one that is going to best answer that call for help. And we have a scientific, proven way of doing that. I mean, I can't think of anything cooler to do, but, I'm obviously biased. Huh? But that's what we see the homeopathic remedy do, is that it changed the whole person, body, mind, and soul changes. They change their worldview, they change their relationships. Like, they come back and they say, there's been a shift in the way I talk to my husband. I even like my mother-in-law, sometimes. So all of, it's not just that my wart went away, or that it's all of those things. And those things we know are going to be much more important in the shift, even before there's a physical manifestation of that shift, because we know that that perceived threat, the perceived stress, is what's being relieved, which is the real cause of disease. And then after that the body's going to be able to find its own way. But it had gotten to a place where the perceived threats are so heightened and so real, even though they're not real, that the body no longer is coherent. It no longer makes sense. Huh? Okay. This other guy is really nice too. I tried to find a picture of him younger because he was even handsomer than Pop. But anyway, Jacques Beneviste. born about the same time as Pop, 1935. He died in 2004, and I think it was really from what happened to him. He didn't fare quite as well as Pop. Maybe he was a little less resistant. But here's this guy, PhD in medicine and immunology, a silver medalist, by the way, as a researcher. Also considered they thought that he would be the first French Nobel Prize in biology. So, not, as my husband would say, pas un toothpick. Okay. He discovered platelet activating factor. I don't know anybody who knows all of the asthma and allergy stuff that we know today is because of him. Okay, so the puffers and all of that stuff, all of that understanding, all of the anti-allergen, antihistamine stuff and everything is due to him finding the platelet activating factor. Okay, so again, pas un toothpick. Okay? So one day, and its papers as well are amongst the most cited. So here's this guy up for the Nobel Prize, okay, doing all of this work. One day, his assistant brought the results of a reaction to cells to very diluted quantities of allergens, okay. He realized that she had mistakenly over-diluted the allergen to the point where there was no material substance left. He says, there's nothing, you made a mistake here. You diluted it to the point where there's only water. And now you're telling me that the cells responded to it when there's only water in there? Go back and do your work. So she redid them, and redid it, and redid it, and redid it. These findings were corroborated by 5 different laboratories in 4 different countries: France, Israel, Italy, and Canada. And they were all able to replicate his results. 13 very well-known prominent scientists collaborated in a 1988 article that was published in Nature. They had conducted over 300 trials before publishing. They did their homework, right? Can we all agree? Okay. What they discovered is that rather than chemical, the allergen response is something electromagnetic. It's a quantum, it's a signal. And then when we start with something and we keep diluting it and shaking it, that we end up with a signal in that water that can still be picked up by the cells. Now this and still goes against, okay, and this is what the real crunch is that pharma makes all their money by going what they call the lock and key principle, In other words, chemical, next, chemical, next, right? So we get the chemicals, we can patent a chemical. We can't patent an electromagnetic signal. So the idea of a chemical and a protein, the whole industry is based on that, and a lot of our economy is based on that. What we do know scientifically is that every molecule can be associated with a specific frequency. This is known. We can actually map out the frequencies of every molecule around. As a matter of fact, the functioning of an MRI, has anybody heard of an MRI? Huh? Okay, you cannot explain the functioning of an MRI unless you understand this principle. Because what the MRI takes a picture of is the water in your body. And it's using the water in your body. And it's not taking a picture of the stuff. It's not taking a picture of the cells. An MRI takes a picture of the water in between your cells. And from the information that it gets from the Fourier wave transforms of that water, it creates the images of your body. That's how an MRI functions. Okay? You cannot explain an MRI unless you understand this, unless you understand that matter, the form of your brain, the form of your cells, the form of your body is the way it is because it is being informed by fields and information that's in the water of your body. So next time you go for an MRI, talk to the technician and they'll look at you like you have 2 heads, because they don't ask how or why. As a matter of fact, we use the MRI for over 20 years without understanding or being able to explain how it functions. Now, what really bothers me is that we've been using it to homeopathy for over 250 years without being able to explain how it functions in that chemical paradigm either. But but we still use the MRIs, right? Okay, so that's the fundamental principle there. And then there's radiance and all those sorts of others. So there's many, many areas and scientists in different areas of research. What did I skip a slide here? Let me just make sure. Yeah, no, it's okay. So the pharma advertisers in Nature were so appalled that they incited a witch hunt, $100,000 offered to disprove his findings. Instead, 3 out of 4 labs, Italy, France, Belgium, and Holland, used impeccable, overcautious, like what they went to, like the person preparing this part, doesn't even know who's going to prepare the next part, then it's shipped by secret to somebody else who's, like they went cuckoo trying to make sure that there's nothing that can interfere, nobody that can, influence the results in some way. And they used homeopathic preparations, and 3 out of the 4 labs got good results. This woman, Professor Ennis, still didn't believe them, and she redid them because she says, I'm going to disprove this homeopathy bunk once and for all. And she said, my results compel me to suspend my disbelief and to start searching for rational explanations for our findings. These results, and those of the other labs that supported his findings, were only published in obscure journals a few years after Menevist had been completely discredited, a guarantee that no one would notice. So he lost everything, his funding, his reputation, his chance at the Nobel Prize, all for publishing that. Over 105 trials of homeopathy, over 81 showed positive results. Where's Joe Schwartz? Okay. Double-blind, placebo-controlled study showing homeopathy effectiveness for asthma. It's one of the, people have, some of the homeopathic research is like so impeccable, is so scientifically rigorous, that it's out of this world. There's a lot of, unfortunately, there's an equal amount of supposed homeopathic research that's done very sloppily and not even according to homeopathy principles. And so when you put those together and you do a meta-analysis, it's like gets all mushed in. But if you look at the ones that are properly done, you get a very different result. Anyway, what did Lancet, one of the biggest scientific journals, say? What could be more absurd than the notion that a substance is therapeutically active in dilution so great that the patient is unlikely to receive a single molecule of it? In other words, we can't. It doesn't matter how much proof you're going to give us. You can drown us in proof, but we're not going to believe it because we can't believe that. It's outside of our paradigm. Okay? So the problem isn't with the evidence, it's that our beliefs defy the evidence. Okay? So what is going on in our brain? What is going on in the way that we take in the world and the way we respond to the world that makes it so hard for us to change our beliefs and to change our worldview? Time for a coffee break? If we think of ourselves as having 3 dimensions of seeing, or 3 eyes, what are they? Obviously, there's the sensory perception. So when we say eye, we think of this little apparatus that sits in the front of our face. What we don't always recognize, however, is that it really is just there's no holes that we see through, at our world. We have the experience as if we look through our eyes. Do you ever hear people say that? Well, what does it look like to you? Meaning, what does it look like through your eyes, as if we're looking through our eyes? And we're not. What we are looking at, what you're all looking at, what we're seeing right now is the signal that your brain has created and projected and makes you feel as if things are out there. But really what your eyes are just a bunch of cones and rods receiving signals that are translated into signals in your brain, all on the electromagnetic spectrum, and holographically processed. We're going to take a look at that this afternoon. It's quite fascinating. But what we call sensory perception, though, is what we think we're seeing. And that's the eye of flesh. It's very simple and empirical. So when you say, I want empirical proof that this works, it means that you've seen it with your own eyes, and it's the eye of flesh. But then there's another eye called the eye of reason. It's only through the eye of reason that we can imagine, for example, a mathematical formula, or that we can imagine something that we haven't seen. A sculptor, okay, even, has to think about how he's going to do something. It's like, what is it that's not, that we don't see, but we can still see on the inside? There's many things that we can imagine with our inner eye. Right? We can daydream and we can visualize, and so visualizations, when we do meditations and visualization, we can use that a different level, different, more subtle eye. So the eye of reason is the one that's connected to our logic and our rational mind. And that's usually based on comparison, measurement, and relationships. So anytime you notice, how come we can measure something is you take your ruler and you compare the number you see on the ruler with the object that you're measuring. Yes? So measurement comes through comparison. It's very important that we understand that everything that comes from our rational mind is in some way related to measurement. And when there's measurement, it's related to comparison. So the sense of self that we create, what we call our ego, is created by our rational mind. Do you see what the next thing I'm going to say? And so what does the ego do all the time is compare and measure. Am I as pretty as she? Am I smart as he? Da 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 da. Right? Who's taller? Who's better? Who's smarter? Who's done? So all of that chatter, and that's what it is, right? I shouldn't have said that. She looked better than I. How am I? What are they thinking? All of that chatter is that comparison. It's measuring. Measuring, comparing, comparing. How am I doing? How am I did? Am I doing better yet today than yesterday? Let me get on the scale. Let me find out. Blah, 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 blah. Okay? That's the sense of self that we have that's created by the rational mind. So by our very definition, our sense of self is based on comparison, measurement, okay, and I'm going to say self-flagellation. Unless, according to your measurement, you're better than everyone else, and therefore you can just stay and be in your superior position. But it's either or, isn't it? Huh? And so we're going either between I'm the best or I'm the worst, or or maybe I'm somewhere in the middle, but that's not good enough. All right? But if you really look at your mental chatter, that's what it's saying all the time. So that is just a dimension of our rational mind, but it is a chatterbox. Have you noticed? Trying to go to sleep at night or have some calm and where's the off button? So our rational mind is what creates a lot of noise, and it's that noise that prevents us from using our eye of contemplation, our third eye. That eye is the inner eye. It's the deepest eye. It's the one that allows us transcender. You see, it was so quick, it went right off there. Okay. And that's actually how it works, is that we get insights. We can't stay in the eye of contemplation very long before the rational mind comes in. Yes? Anybody notice that? Try to meditate? See, don't think. It's like saying, don't think about elephant, right? Like, all you're thinking about is thinking. Okay. So, the eye of contemplation, that momentary transcendent insight, which is beyond reason, translogical. And that in itself is one of our biggest obstacles, because with Newton came which age? Anybody know what that age that starting with Newton began? Age of reason. Yes, it's the age of reason. Yeah, the age of enlightenment, but we sort of got that wrong. But age of reason, and with it came all of our rational processes, and with it came this very measured sense of self. that is always measuring itself and always comparing itself and creating all that chatter. So we live in that world in our modern day society. We live in that chatter all the time. Every time we come, no matter what we do. And periodically, if we're really, really lucky, we get a moment of awe, that we're actually able to look at something and go, oh, and not think, and not compare, and not classify. That you can see a flower and just see the flower without labels and without comparison, without measurement, and without thinking about it. That it can be seen for the awesomeness that it is, that we can see ourselves for the awesomeness that all of life, I mean the planet, everything is awesome. We should be like walking around with our mouths open all the time, really, if we were to really see with the eye of contemplation. I guess that might not be good. We'd catch a lot of flies. Anyway, there might be some drawbacks to that one. Okay. But what's really interesting is that even Newton, how did he come to the theory of gravity that he came to? The story of the apple, right? Story of the apple, but really he was imagining, right? And he was, so he was a hermetic, he was an alchemist, like almost all of the physicists before him. But so was Einstein. Not that he was a hermeticist, but he came to the theory of relativity through his mind experiments, right? He used to talk about that all the time, how he was always late for work, so he used to be the last person to get on the train. And because he was the last person getting on the train, he would just like grab, how the old trains were, and he was sort of, then like in the old movies, he'd grab like that railing, and sort of grab on and get on. And because he was in the last caboose of the last train in the last part, he would see the clock, and he was late, so he was wondering what time it was. So he was seeing the clock of the train station move away from him. Right? So this was his daily experience, going to work. And so while he was doing that, he contemplated. He looked at that clock, not with the rational mind, not with the rational mind would be saying, oh my God, it's 8 o'clock, what's my boss going to say, blah, 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 right? That's what our rational mind would say. Instead, he was looking at it with the eye of contemplation and saying, what if I were a light beam? How come I can see that clock? I can see that clock because light from the sun is bouncing off the clock, traveling through space, and coming to my eye. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to see it, right? Well, it's the photons coming from the sun are bouncing off the white face of the clock, and they're traveling through space, and they're coming to greet me, and that's how I can see that clock. Okay, physics explains that. But then this eye of contemplation said, but what if I was traveling on one of those photons? What would I see? What time would it be for me? So if this train was going at the speed of light, and I was looking at that clock, what time would it be for me? Anyone want to guess? Be always 8 o'clock. Huh? That photon that strikes the clock at 8 o'clock and travels at, if I was traveling at the same speed as that photon, it would always be 8 o'clock for me. And that's how the theory of relativity came to be, was through that mind experiment. Yeah? So this is what physicists do all the time. That's why they're so weird. David Bohm did that too. He figured out how a gyroscope worked by being a gyroscope. He went through the forest gyroscoping. So this is what physicists do, at least when no one's watching. When you come into their laboratory, they're busy doing stuff, But as soon as you leave the room, they're contemplating. And we just have to look at some of the world's greatest physicists to know that that's where they go. Wolfgang Pauli, if they're not like that before physics, then they are after. If they really got somewhere, if they really saw something, if they really truly made a discovery. So Wolfgang Pauli, it should be Pauli with an I, sorry. He was incredible. The Pauli principle, it's a cornerstone of quantum mechanics. I won't go into everything he did, but after he made his discoveries, he wrote books on the Kabbalah. And he collaborated with Carl Jung. Everybody know Carl Jung, great psychologist, on archetypes. Why? Because quantum physics brings us to that place of archetypes. The eye of contemplation, when we truly understand what is happening, when we truly see through with the eye of contemplation, then we go to the land of archetypes, the land of symbols. Same thing with Edwin Schrödinger. Schrödinger's equations are the basics. If you go and look up quantum physics, the basis of quantum physics mathematically is Schrödinger's equations. He ended up being passionate about Hindu philosophy. And Heisenberg, the father of and Niels Bohr, okay, the atom, the whole design of the atom and what have you, and the atomic bomb and everything else, is because of Niels Bohr. The Tao and Chinese philosophy is what he ended up writing about and getting into. Werner Heisenberg wrote the Tao of Physics and was really into Platonic philosophy. So, Platonic philosophy. So let's take a look at that, because Plato really, I can see why Heisenberg went towards Plato. Plato talked about formal cause. He talked about the essence. Okay, he said basically what we see as things each have their own unique identity. We know that, right? Everything is different. Every one of us is different. Well, imagine there's 8 billion of us. How many billions of human beings have been on the planet? No two are alike. No two are alike. That's amazing. I mean, even statistically, that shouldn't happen, And even twins, and somebody's going to argue with twins coming from the same egg, yeah. But even twins, I've had so many twins come through my office, and I never give the same remedy to the two, because they are different. It's my job as a homeopath to see how they are. They might look alike, but they're not. So the essence, so what is that essence? So these two twins, identical, they seem identical, they talk alike, look alike, dress alike, their essence is different. Each has a different soul. And that essence is not the sum of the parts, is what makes that unique, is actually what is the essence that makes it a whole. That's just Plato's definition of soul, okay? So his theory of forms was the highest form of reality. And he said, it's not the material world that's real. It's this abstract, archetypal level of reality that's real. And the essences, okay, is that which, without which a thing would not be what it is. Okay, so we did an exercise in class where there was outside of the room, somebody had thrown a table outside a window or off a balcony or something, and it was all, or a chair, and it was all mangled, and at the bottom of the street, and somebody put it in the garbage, and it was all, legs were sticking up, and it was all mangled. But everybody knew it was a chair. Didn't look like a chair. Might have even been missing a leg. How do we know it's a chair? So that essence of chairness, okay, is an archetype. And that's what we use to identify everything in our world. Anything that we can identify, it's because we hold an archetype of it. When we can't identify something, or when we fail to see it, it's because we haven't created an archetype for it. We haven't gotten in touch with that archetype. Another way to see it is that we haven't tapped into the zero-point field, into the conscious stream that allows us to access that archetype and bring it in. So when we create things that never existed before, it's because that inspiration has come through the eye of contemplation and through that archetypal form. Before we make a plane, somebody had an idea of a plane. And before that, they had to have some sense of what that essence would be. So this is what, Socrates and Plato, and talking about it being transcendent. And, the idea of before a sculptor makes a sculpture, he has an idea. He has a form. It takes form first in his eye of contemplation, and then in his eye of reason as he figures out how he's going to do it. And then he actually does it. But he has a picture. He has a sense of what that is. And even before the picture, before the physical picture, there's a sense of what he wants to capture with that. Right? Is it beauty? Is it strength? Is it power? True artists and sculptures that move us are those that are much more than just physically perfect. It's because they capture an essence. And anyone who looks at that will see, you look at the statue of David, it's the picture of courage. How could you, Okay, and what went into that picture of courage so that we know when we look at David that he stands for courage? Well, that's the eye of contemplation. So when you go to the museum or when you see a piece of art, what is the essence, what is the archetype that is being, it's not about the physical form. It's not about what you see with your eye of flesh. Art isn't about the eye of flesh. Nor is it the eye of reason, because the eye of reason is just going to tell you whether or not they missed something, whether or not it's perfectly symmetrical, whether or not, it's a mere measurement. That's not what you go to either, It's like somebody talking about going to a symphony and every note had to be perfect, so we just should have machines doing the music, so that every note is perfect. There's no soul in that. There may be rational perfection, but what is the essence? And that essence is something that through humans that we can capture and communicate, which is a very special gift that we have. So the eye of contemplation, the realm of archetype, symbol, representation, and correspondence, and that is the principle of homeopathy, by the way, is not that we give you what it is, but we give you the thing that it represents. So we first have to find out what things represent for you, and through what things represent for you, distill that into what is the essence that moves you. What is the essence of your soul? That's all we do by homeopathy. That's it. What do you do for a living? I figure out people's souls. But it's true. It's true. It's really, we have to discern the essence of the individual before we can give them a remedy. Otherwise, it's a superficially acting remedy. Doesn't mean that it won't do anything. We can do homeopathy different ways as well, much more superficially, and it'll still do something. But when we really distill that with the person, not only that, but the person gets insight about themselves. What a better gift than to go home and to have a sense of your soul, a sense of your essence, a sense of who you are. Okay, so the mind is immaterial. It's the spiritual power of the soul. The brain is the physical organ of the body. The mind is not limited to the brain. The brain is just the organ through which mind can come. It's the receptor, if you like. It's the physical manifestation of it, but mind is much, much beyond it. It's not the brain. Stuff can't enter your mind, only form can. Okay, so what we see and what we know about the way the brain works as a hologram is that it only perceives really the energetic forms of things and then create, just like the MRI. The MRI doesn't take pictures of anything, remember. The MRI just picks up the vibrations that are in the water cavities, that are in the cavities that contain water in your body, and from that waveform, Fourier waveform transformations of those signals is able to create the images of the MRI. Okay, so that's basically what our brain is doing as well. Okay, so our mind via the soul can access that level, but for that we have to understand what is symbolic. And symbolic knowledge or symbolic awareness, okay, that everything corresponds to a symbol or form or idea which is in consciousness, but not necessarily what we've, and this is where it gets really tricky, because what something symbolizes for me isn't necessarily what it's going to symbolize for you. So to have a book of symbols is not any help at all, okay? So it's like doing dream interpretation as if you can look it up in the encyclopedia, maybe, but really dream interpretation has to come through the dreamer. What was your experience, and what did that mean to you? And what was the symbolic representation of that? Okay, so every symbol represents the relationship between the knower and the known, between the subject and the object, between what the I is experiencing. In other words, it's the foundation of our experience is the symbolic or archetypal experience. Okay, so it's known through symbol, through form, and that's what holds the essence. Everything that exists has an essence, an archetypal or symbolic dimension. That's what we call form. And we have to know what the thing represents to the individual. What are you moved by? What moves your soul? What stirs your flame? Even if it's a red sports car. Or the Montreal Canadiens, or your religion, or your animal activism, or when you dance, or when you meditate. All of these things, what you do, you like, that you think you're defining yourself by. I'm a Montreal Canadiens fan. Okay, there's a lot of people who are Montreal Canadiens fan, but what does that represent for you? Well, so it's the symbol of it, and for that we need the eye of contemplation. We can rationalize why we like the Montreal Canadiens more than any other team. But when we have to say what they represent and what it symbolizes, then we have to use our eye of contemplation. And we know in our case taking, when our case taking is working, because the person stops looking at us. They're looking inside. You know? When you're in that place and you're trying to see inside yourself, then we know that our case taking is doing well. So we always look for that. If the person's looking right at us and they're just talking to us, we're not there yet. We have to ask questions and bring them along until they start self-reflecting and having to go into and use their eye of contemplation. So that's one of our signals that we're really getting somewhere, is when the eye of contemplation kicks in. So we use questions like that. What does it represent to you? What does it symbolize? And you know, that's what we put importance on, but that we put importance of the physical manifestations of that symbol. So the red sports car becomes so important because it symbolizes power. But what's power for me? And what does that represent? And what does that mean for me? You see? So it's going that other level that we really understand why the red sports car, or why the Montreal Canadiens, or why whatever. So it's not the thing, it's what it represents. Whatever that is. Okay. So, absolutes. What we're looking at here is what is essentially human. What are we by design, and what is the essence of our consciousness? Okay, so it is only when we get to that eye of contemplation that we start having answers to those questions. And it's things that have no opposite. So I'm putting words here, and people say, oh, yes, there's an opposite to that. It's not, the opposite of love is hate. Everybody knows that. On the rational level, that's true. But through the eye of contemplation, it isn't. So whenever we see or think that something has its opposite, it's because we're still on the rational level. When we go to the eye of contemplation, it's not that hate disappears. But hate and love are seen as a dance. They're seen as two parts of the same thing. And what is that thing? What is the hate around and what is the love around? Because you'll find that the hate and the love are around the same thing. And what does that thing represent? You see? The representation of both what we hate and what we love is that. People who are deeply, deeply, passionately in love can kill each other. Yes? Happens all the time. Crime of passion, as a matter of fact, you can get off with crime of passion because they know how strong that is. Okay? Well, how do we explain that? We can only understand that if we understand what that person represents to the other. Because that representation, that the symbolizes, okay, in those moments that they feel love, that level of love, okay, when that isn't there, or when that is challenged, that's when they feel hate or repulsion. Right? So that love-hate thing is around the same thing. It's just the yin and yang around the same center. Okay? So for whatever we have a dualistic or an opposing view of, we have to look at the other side and find what we have in common. Find what it's revolving around, what is the dynamic around which that is happening. I used to say there's nothing more racist than an anti-racist. You know, what is at the center of that? And we can't do it rationally. We can't do it rationally. It's very limited. We stay in duality and we stay doing this and butting heads and arguing which side and which side. We have to together sit down and find what the dynamic center of our duality is. And when we come to the dynamic center of our duality, we find that it's one of these words, but one of these words as an absolute, not as part of a duality. Okay, and that's one of the signs of shifting into the eye of contemplation. Of course, we only have our words, so it's always limited. So now we're going to do the exercise. I want you to take a piece of paper, and I would like you to write down, what are you moved by? What moves your soul? I want you to sink into that. Okay. Thank you for getting back on time, everybody. Really appreciate it. We thought we were going to be ready with the vials before you arrived, but there were a lot more changes. Had like 6 people leaving this morning, so they had to... Anyway, you'll see afterwards why it was complicated for us. Yeah, so dimensions of consciousness. I talked about Jacques Beneviste this morning. Remember good old Jacques? He's the guy who lost all his funding and everything else because he discovered that there was, even with no substance in it, that it had effects on the cells. Remember the allergen specialist this morning? Okay. So here's another thing that happened to him. So things just got worse for poor old Jacques. If it wasn't bad enough that here he was, having just written an article that a bottle of water, or a drop of water could affect a living cell and became the laughingstock of the science world. Now, okay, he said, well, this is it. And essentially he was really upset because, so he's discredited. They take away his funding. They say, you're not, a good researcher or whatever. We don't believe you. And all of these other laboratories are substantiating his results, but nobody's publishing that, and nobody's taking back the discreditation that he had. So even for many years, this was, if you see pictures of Jacques, you see how he aged during that process, It was quite a struggle for him. Anyway, but on top of it, so one day he said, that's it. He said, they keep saying that we're doing something and that, my lab or the lab people, or that it somehow, something is happening, something monkeying around is happening. So he had a robot made. He said, that's it. I'm going to make a robot to make these preparations. And that way nobody can put it down to human error or human interference or anything else. So he had a robot made that would make the dilutions, the homeopathic dilutions, and conduct the experiment and do all of that. So great. So it has this robot, and the robot worked extremely well, except on Wednesdays. So all of his data would corroborate what he had said, that basically these bottles of water, these drops of water would have an effect on a living cell on every day except Wednesday. On Wednesday, that same preparation would have no effect. So, what's going on, he thought. So he looked, couldn't figure it out. Then he looked at the people who were in the lab on the different days and realized that on Wednesday, there was a researcher who was there. She was a particular doctor and biologist, she was a medical doctor and biologist, who was in the lab only on Wednesdays. And when she was in the lab, that's when the preparations made by the robot didn't work. I guess he was wondering about his sanity at this point, right? So now I'm in real, okay? So, and it was weird because she was a meticulous worker, she followed protocols, but the results were always false when she was around the robot. So he asked her to hold a vial of homeopathic remedy. Right? So he measured the homeopathic remedy before he gave it to her, then he had her hold it, then he measured it after. And he wasn't able, after she held it, to measure the signaling that he usually got from a homeopathic remedy. So in other words, her holding it actually scrambled the signals. Remember Fritz? And he said the carcinogens scramble the signals, right? From our food and therefore to that. So he says maybe it's that kind of effect then. Is it, it could be that she was scrambling the frequencies. And that somehow her presence around the robot actually interfered with the robot. I know you guys are saying this is getting weirder, but here we go. I'm going to go to Princeton University. Everybody's heard of Princeton University? Very well known, actually, Doug Wallace that we were talking about before, and that's where Martin published his results as well. Ivy League, very well known, very prestigious, you know, solid science. They have a department called PAIR, which is the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research. Doctors Robert John and Brenda Dunn are two PhD researchers. Robert John actually didn't have his name associated with this department until later on, but Brenda Dunn was fine with it. She was a psychologist. They spent 28 years 28 years, thousands, and we're not thousands, but tens of thousands of experiments involving millions of trials. I think there's, you know, something like 500 or 800,000 people that participated over that 28-year period of doing these, of collecting this data. Can you imagine how phenomenal that is? And what they did is they had what's called a REG, which is a random signal generator. Okay, so it's a machine that is guaranteed to give you random signals. So it's like flipping a coin. Okay, so it could be here, it could be there. Now, a flip of a coin, sometimes you'll get more heads or tails for the first few times, but after a certain period of time, if it's random, if it's truly random, which it's supposed to be, it ends up being 50-50. Okay, so since this machine is specifically designed to make these random signals, we always expect it to be random, unless something is affecting it. And something is affecting its randomness. All right? So what they did in their experiments is they had people interact with this machine in all different ways. So it could be anything from showing pictures to a number, or, you know, and people would want, let's say, a certain number to show up more, or a certain kind of picture to show up more. So let's say if they had pictures of scenes and pictures of archetypes or something, you know, something like that, then, you know, people would want their favorite picture to show up more, and therefore the random generator wouldn't be so random anymore. Okay, if that were true. If we were able to affect a machine, that means that we could make it go from random 50-50 to something different than 50-50. So 28 years of this, and it proved without a doubt that human beings can affect not only machines, but bacteria, yeast, ants, plants, chicks, mice, rats, dogs, human cellular preparations, and enzyme activities, amongst many others. But just to give you sort of a, okay, so these guys did this test with everything. And they started with the random signal generator, but then they moved into all of this. Can we make the ants, you know, be more busy doing this, or can we cause the yeast to do that, or can we cause the chicks to go more into the right one than the left one, or can we? And in each time, in each experiment, they were able to show that the randomness was definitely and statistically affected. In other words, just the presence of it. Now, what's really funny, you guys are going to find this funny, women have a much bigger effect on it. In other words, you know, so a woman would have a bigger effect on affecting either the machine or the chicks or whatever, except that half the time it wouldn't be the way she wanted it. Men had less of an effect, but it was what they wanted. Isn't that interesting? That explains a lot, eh? So all of this statistical data came out, but it was undeniable. These two researchers, You know, and we're talking, the other fellow that was involved was the Dean of Engineering at Princeton. And the person who has actually supplied a lot of the funding was Edgar Mitchell, who had been on the Apollo 14 flight and was very interested in consciousness because that flight changed his consciousness. So, yes, human intention, even human presence can affect all those things. And the ability to influence other living things on many levels, from muscular activity to motor activity, cellular changes, and even the nervous system. So they were able to, you know, strap electrodes, measure activity, all scientifically document how, even from one human to another, that we can affect how that other person's body is operating on a very subtle level. Not Dunn's daughter, but John's daughter ended up also being a researcher, and she continued his work during the AIDS epidemic, supposedly. Worked with AIDS patients and did a whole spectrum of studies on everything from prayer to Reiki to sending energy to thinking about somebody to all of those, you know, healing at a distance, intentional works, and was able to document a very different response from the control group and the ones that were being sent healing energies. So all of these studies, what they boil down to is, in human experience, the greatest effect occurred when the people to be influenced really needed it. You know? So the greater the need, the more easily they were helped. They seem to be more receptive to influence than others. In other words, that place of surrender is when then the intent can more easily come in and have that influence. And that the influence on others, okay, because we all know about biofeedback, right? And how you can, you know, they have all of the biofeedback experimentation that's been done by the Heart Math Institute in California and all of these other institutes where they put you in front of a machine and you know, so for people with heart problems, etc., that they can watch their heartbeat and actually go into meditation and visualize and calm their hearts and heal their hearts in many different ways, you know, and work with that energy in that way. And so we know that there can be what's called biofeedback. We're then getting the information about what's going on in our body, and then we interact with that to actually make an effect on our body. That biofeedback that we can do on ourselves is only marginally stronger than the influence we have with someone else. So whether it's on my body or your body, that biofeedback mechanism is almost as effective. So no real difference between you and me when it comes down to that level.
Is this, what do I want to say, conducted on what the intention that the person has, or is it just how that person is?
Well, like I said, the intention of which person?
Well, you're saying one could influence the other. Is it just who that person is, or do they have to have an intention that they're consciously trying to heal something in the other person?
Sometimes they don't even know the person's name or don't even know who they are or anything else or what they have or anything. They're just asked, you know, to focus on an individual in this place, or they're given sort of a coordinate of some kind, and yeah. So in those healing experiments, yeah, they're very often double-blind. And for those of us who think that somehow human beings are superior and the only ones to be able to do this, think again. Because even baby chicks, fresh out of their little eggs, can influence a machine. You've got to admire the scientists of thinking up all of these experiments, don't you? Like, can you imagine what it is living with one of these guys? Oh, I just thought we're going to take these baby chicks and we're going to set up the random signal machine, because it's with the random signal machine, can also be a random movement machine. In other words, the machine is going to do random movements in any direction, okay, which means that it does an equal number of movements to the right as it does to the left, okay? Just to say. So this random generator can move to the right, move to the left. You put baby chicks, okay, you dress up the machine as a chicken or anything else, you know, they follow anything that moves anyway. They think it's mom. And just the presence of the baby chicks makes the random machine move more often in their direction than any other. Baby chicks, fresh out of their eggs. Huh? And the same thing with baby rabbits too. Just so that you know, they thought maybe it was just something special to the chicken world, but no. Or that Colonel Sanders would die and go to heaven and find out that God was a chicken, but no. So whatever animal we tested with, they were able to influence the machine. So consciousness in any form, even with animals, consciousness in any living being, as far as we know. So what does quantum theory say about this? That basically everything is made of consciousness. Consciousness is the only reality. Matter, as in the equation E equals mc squared, is consciousness just in a collapsed dimension. As we talked about before, light is the expression of pure consciousness in the collapsed 3D space-time dimension. Starting to get a little wordy there. But basically, we and everything around is consciousness. There's no separation. We are eddies in the stream of consciousness. We're all in the same river, and we're just eddies in those rivers. Now, there's no separation there. You know, the eddies are just little spins inside the movement of the river. Which means that there is no me-you duality. Me and you, or you and me, two for T, but no, there's no me-you duality, that basically we are one. We talked about that at the beginning, how, right, we are all one human entity as consciousness. And that's a little inside joke for the MICHers, because we call our method the Numi dynamic method, which if you break up the word, it's no, you, me, dynamic method. Numi is also the word for soul, and also the word for noumenon rather than phenomenon, and so that word has many different inside jokes to it. Okay. At the basis of life is not chemical reactions, but energetic exchanges with the zero-point field or consciousness. That is the basis of life. We are alive because of constant interchanges, and especially through our mitochondria, because those are those little quantum organelles that are situated in every single one of our cells, that can be in constant interaction with the stream of consciousness. Rather than genes or germs, that which finally determines whether we're healthy or ill lies in the what do I want to say there? In the field of consciousness, which Einstein called the only reality. So what happened since Copernicus and since Newton is that we took a little bit of a detour. We took a technological detour, a technical one, and went from that beautiful, lovely, harmonious scene of the planets in perfect circles to one where space was just this barren emptiness, a vacuum, and that we were separate, and that we were chemical, and that we're mechanical, and that life is just a chemical process, and evolution is a chemical process. But we were discovering that that paradigm is not only isolating and stress-causing and not so pretty, it's also not true. That paradigm cannot explain the basic functions of energy, of atoms, of life, how life begins or ends, or how a single cell turns into a being. That can only happen through consciousness and an understanding of consciousness. Now, I don't know if you want to hear this guy. Like, one of the things that I like to do is try to find something that is totally opposite to my point of view, for fun. Like, we all have like a point of view. So you go on the internet and find somebody who says, so here I am, I'm saying, oh, okay, I'm going to do this quantum talk, right, and talk about quantum physics. Why don't I go onto the internet and find somebody who's really trying to put it down and say it's not true, and this is a bunch of malarkey, and So I went and started listening to those. And this is one of them. So this is a fellow, and you were right, Alex, he is a software engineer. With very good math, though. I was very impressed by his math. Anyway, the software engineer, very brilliant software engineer, who wanted to find out what this quantum conspiracy was, and what are these people trying to make us believe exactly? That the physical world we live in isn't what we think it is? What kind of conspiracy is that? What are they trying? So That's how he sort of set this up. And he worked with a quantum physicist and went through all sorts of mathematical formulations, and then he's giving us the results of that. Now, of course, what I find interesting, I'll tell you how I listen to these things, is whenever I listen to someone who I know has a completely opposite point of view from me, I sit and I listen to what the divine attribute is that they're speaking from. And it was because that's what, so what gets in the way of us being able to accept something is because it doesn't fit into my idea of what that is, of whatever that my spark is. So if my thing is beauty, do you know, and that doesn't sound beautiful, I don't want that theory. No? Or if my thing is harmony, or if my thing is, right? So I have, there's not only my divine attribute, but there's my idea of what that divine attribute should look like. Don't forget, now that's the rational mind taking that archetypal. So you see, so we have this, we each have an archetype, and that's what this morning was to see, right? We each have an archetype, we each have a divine attribute that is behind everything that we do, and everything that we like, and everything that moves us, right? Huh? That's what's behind everything. And that divine attribute is who we are. But when the rational mind takes it, interprets it, and tries to own it, then it becomes an opinion. And there's a famous saying by a fellow, he said, opinions are like assholes. Everybody has one. Then he made a corollary to that, and he said, and unlike our assholes, we should keep our opinions in close and constant surveillance. And make sure we're watching them at all times. So we all have a divine attribute. We all have something that for us is what life is about. But when we make that into our opinion, when we boil that down into our interpretation and opinion, that's where we get caught. And that's where the division starts, and that's where the trouble begins. Okay. So that's what I do when I listen to this. I say, oh, so this guy, what I realized as I was listening, you have to listen to it really, really carefully, because all this guy is doing is talking mathematics and physics, right? But through that, I could hear what his problem was with quantum physics, and it boiled down to one thing, that quantum physics was basically saying that our universe is not knowable and not predictable. So what divine attribute do you think he has? Absolute knowledge, right? Absolute knowing. And so if we have a theory that says we can never know, well, I don't like that theory too much. You know, my whole thing is that we should be able to know everything. So that's what he tried to, so he went about trying to prove that no. And what's really interesting is in trying to prove mathematically that the universe isn't random, okay, and that it actually can be predictable, he made his own discovery. So you want to hear it?
Entanglement.
Whoops. I clicked once too many.
Enormous web of entanglement that has since proliferated at the speed of light. I have to bring all those particles back together and recombine them. And in principle, that's possible, and in practice, obviously, it's not, which is why classical measurements seem to be irreversible, despite the fact that the physics of the universe say that everything is reversible. So this has some philosophical implications. I called it the zero universe interpretation of quantum mechanics. If you buy this as a description of what the physics of the universe is really like, then it tells you unambiguously that it is not the case that the reason that measurements are consistent across space and time is because there's a real underlying metaphysical reality out there. It tells you, in fact, the exact opposite. That what we really are is, as David Merman puts it, correlations without correlata. We are not made of atoms. We are actually made of bits. We are our thoughts. And these thoughts actually reside, if you will forgive stretching a metaphor to the breaking point, we are a simulation running on a quantum computer. I'm going to skip that. So the take-home message is, going back to the Einstein quote, that the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it's comprehensible. Here's an explanation in terms of physical theory of why the universe is comprehensible. Quantum mechanics actually predicts a comprehensible universe, but at the cost of forcing you to believe that what you perceive as physical reality is not actually real. It's actually an illusion.
He has to accept that, oh, now we can hear me a bit? Oh, it's a bit dead, eh? He has to accept that but true scientist in that, that's what he came to anyway, and he goes on, and I won't play all of it because it's a bit long, but he talks about exactly why. And he ends up with a metaphor about, the three monks and the flag and what's moving, and a very Buddhist kind of ending. Maybe I should play that. Would you like to see that part? It's really cute. But anyway, basically that we can't explain our world.
Enormous web of entangled.
Let me just, I can't control it, so I won't do that. But anyway, basically he says that we can't explain our world from the dimension in which we live. So what exists in our world, just from a mathematician point of view, he showed all the math of this, what exists in our world is what we call real numbers that start at 0 and go up, right? And then we have negative numbers, and we sort of can tolerate them. But one of the numbers the series of numbers we can't have that don't have any meaning or reality is what's called complex numbers, which is like the square root of -1. But the thing is that in order to explain our physical world, we have to use these numbers that don't represent anything and that don't exist in our physical world. So as a mathematician, he had to come to the conclusion that we can't logically explain anything in our world. Then that it really is from another dimension. That the underlying reality of the material world is inexplicable through the material. It's outside of space-time and outside of 3D. As I said before, things can't go faster than light because they're made of light. We're made of light. We can't go faster than it. Consciousness outside space-time is faster than the speed of light because it is everywhere at once. There's no place for it to go. Consciousness is everywhere. It is absolute. There's nothing opposite to it, and nothing that is not it. So all of the words for the absolute, for the archetypes that we have, are actually pointing to that dimension, which is just beyond our dimension. When we see light, we're seeing the fourth dimension of consciousness collapse into our 3D world. Now I'm wondering, what time do we... Just making sure I have enough time for this. We're supposed to start the experiment at 2:30, eh? Yeah. Okay. So what I was just going to show you here, and I don't know if I'm going to go into it too much, but this is a group of scientists. This is the World Science Festival. And these guys are sitting around and saying, okay, how do we picture 4 dimensions? And because we know, so now we know, quote unquote, okay, it's been proven to us that the true reality, that what we're seeing is only 3 dimensions of a 4-dimensional reality. Okay? So what does that mean then? So, so what is it that we think we're seeing? And so one of the ways that we can sort of twist our brain around that is to go down a dimension. So let's say instead of 3D, let's pretend we're 2D. Let's pretend that we live in Flatland. Anybody hear about that book? It's one of my favorite books, Flatland. Anyway, let's pretend that we're flat people and that we only have 2 dimensions. That means we can only go this way, or this way, right? Or this way, or this way. We can't go up and down, right? Because there's no up and down. So we're taking away up and down. Everybody with me? Okay, so there's no up and down. That means that you're living inside a sheet of paper. Okay, that's your world. And so, if you're living inside of a sheet of paper, let's say you were visited by someone from 4D, from 3D, in this case, right? It'd be like us visiting. So if you're visited by somebody, what would that look like? So,
plane. So if we were two-dimensional beings living on the surface of this plane, unable to see anything off this plane, what would we see? What we see as the sphere comes in. So from this perspective right here, if we're a little flat being on this two-dimensional world, as the three-dimensional sphere passes through, we just see this growing shape. It's actually a circle that gets bigger and bigger, smaller and smaller, and we would actually just see what looked like a line getting bigger and smaller.
With strange little endpoints on it.
That's right. That's right.
okay, so this is Dr. Quantum. So what they're saying basically, okay, if we consider and know that we are all four-dimensional beings in reality, what we see in this three-dimensional world is us being born into it, getting bigger, bigger, and bigger, bigger, and then getting small, 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 and then disappearing. But that's a 4D being going through 3D dimension. That's all that is. So what this life, what we call this life, is going through the 3D dimension. Anyway, if you like Dr.
Their
Quantum,
2D
it's all over
perspective, my
does
3D
quite a few
finger
little
looks something
experiments about
like
that.
this.
And here in this one, he's visiting the 2D world. He just put his finger through their plane. And then he comes back and he tortures this poor little circle. He starts talking
Hello,
to a
little circle. Fear of the unknown. Or should I say, not yet known. It's a puzzle. If we see only what we know, how does anyone ever see anything new? The unknown. How do we ever get out of our box? Hello, little circle. Don't be afraid.
Now don't forget, she can't see up or down.
Where are you?
This is always the tricky part to explain. I'm in another dimension, another space. I am above you.
Never use that word.
What word?
The A word.
Above?
It's forbidden.
Well, what do you think it means?
I don't know. And I don't want to know. You can be severely punished if you use that word. Are you a ghost?
I hope not. I just have a different perspective than you do. I can see things in a way you can't yet.
Oh, yeah? Like what?
Well, okay, you have a safe hidden in your pantry. And inside it, you have 12 coins, a will, and a passport.
How did you know that? What are you? Are you a god?
Well, no more than you. You see, since I am above you, in the third dimension, I can see inside things in your world.
Third dimension? You are a crazy ghost. There's only two. Look.
So, touch the inside of your stomach. How would I do that?
Well, you'd have to cut through my skin. Otherwise, it's impossible. Stop!
Ready for more?
More what?
Dimensions.
Oh.
Directions.
No. Yes, but there aren't any.
Anyway, it's quite cute. You can get quite, on a Saturday morning, if you're on a rainy Saturday morning, can have fun. And there's a number of really cool YouTube films that elaborate on
But
that.
unfortunately,
actually
you
help
cannot
visualize
And I'll try to describe what I see from there.
The different dimensions.
But before we begin, I'll draw a straight line on the board. Let me just mark the origin here.
So what he's going to do there is he's going to go from one dimension to two dimensions to three to four, and then through computer generations, they show us what 4D would look like, sort of, like geometric 4D, and basically is that as they're turning in space, it's as if you're seeing inside and through and beyond. Anyway, it's quite cute. It plays with your mind a little bit. But the point is that we can't explain the world without going to the acceptance of a fourth dimension, which is consciousness. And that's actually the only way that we can explain mass. Now, you would think that by this time we could tell you what weight is, right? Pretty sort of thing that we live with every day, how much does this weigh, da-da-da. Well, we can tell you how much it weighs, but we don't know why it weighs. We still don't know why it weighs. And the only way that we can explain weight or mass at all is by a curvature of space-time. That is basically what the theory of relativity and the general theory tell us, and has been proven. It was proven in 1915 when we saw the solar eclipse and the rays of the sun be bent by the moon during the lunar eclipse of the sun. So the general theory of relativity says that space-time is curved and that its curvature defines or creates mass or matter. And we proved this theory right during the solar eclipse of 1915. If space-time is curved, it has to curve into another dimension. In other words, this is 2D, right? Everybody agrees? If I want to make this into 3D, I have to either go up or go down, right? To make a shape out of it. Yes? Okay? So, to make anything into a shape from 2D, I would have to go into 3D, which means it curves into the other dimension. It curves into above, as the little circle would scream right now, because we're doing above right here, okay, above or below, right? We're going beyond the 2 dimensions of the paper in order to make this curved. So that's what it's saying. Now, if you can imagine that this is 3D, and that 3D is curved, and what is it curved into? It's curved into the 4th dimension, which is consciousness. Okay? And that's our experience of matter. So now, what was interesting about the pair guys again is that in a lot of the experiments that they did, the images which produced the most successful outcomes, so this was interesting. So they had they put pictures like of Anubis, the god of death, and, from Egyptian times, and what they thought were spooky pictures, and then they put pictures of the beach and So even if people found them spooky, they still showed up more often than any other picture, even if they liked it more. So the archetypal images, whether we like them or not, are more, if you like, drawn into our reality than any others. Okay? So there is a natural tendency for whatever we were doing, for that archetypal level of consciousness, to find ways of sneaking in to our 3 dimensions, whether we like them or not. So it is this level of mind that somehow has the capability of communicating with the subtangible physical world, the quantum world of possibility. The marriage, and this I'm reading right off their website, by the way. Okay, these are 2 engineers and research people. Communicating with the subtangible physical world, the quantum world of possibility, the marriage of unformed mind and matter would assemble itself into something tangible in the manifest world. So they're really feeling that that archetypal level is fundamental to manifestation. Ready for the exercise? All right. So basically what we've been saying is that we are all consciousness. We're made of consciousness. And that is something that is accessible to us, is part of us, is a dimension of our own consciousness. But it exists, and we can't have access to it through logic or through the rational, only through the archetypal or the symbolic. Now this makes total sense to homeopaths, because we don't give you the exact thing, we give you what it represents. We give you a symbol. So when we take the whole bunch of symptoms and everything that's happening in you and want to look at that as a whole, we have to look at what it symbolizes in nature, what it can correspond to as a symbol in nature. And that's what we give. Then we give you that thing from nature, which best captures the archetype that you're holding, the archetype that underlies your state.